Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking a really close look at something complex, definitely evolving fast, and, well, frankly, with huge implications. Russia's deepening engagement across Africa.
Yeah, it's a big one. We've been immersing ourselves in this pretty significant analysis, a really in-depth report that kind of pulls back the curtain on Russia's strategies, its influence, what it's actually doing on the ground.
And it looks hard at this shift, right? From the Wagner Group to this new Africa Corps. What does that actually mean?
Exactly. And our mission here, for this deep dive is to get beyond just the headlines. We want to pull out the really critical insights from this analysis for you.
Help you understand the core tactics Russia's using, what this move to a formal structure really signifies.
And the concrete consequences. What's actually happening to the nations involved because of this?
Because as we were digging into this report, some of the findings were pretty striking, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. You see this really stark contradiction, between what Russia says its goals are in Africa.
It's public statements.
Right. And the reality of its actions. And the analysis points to significant human costs, economic costs. It's hard to ignore.
Definitely not the simple story you might hear sometimes.
Not at all. Okay, so maybe we should start by unpacking the two main frameworks the analysis uses to really get a handle on Russia's presence.
Good idea. What are they?
Well, first, there's this concept of a shadow war. And second, the report makes a strong case for characterizing Russia's activities as basically neocolonialism.
Okay, shadow war. That sounds intriguing. What does the report mean by that?
It defines it as a deliberate campaign, but one that operates below the threshold of what you'd call conventional warfare.
So not outright invasion.
Exactly. It's all about subversion, sabotage, using tools that make it incredibly difficult to even recognize what's happening, let alone attribute it.
What kind of tools are we talking about?
Well, the analysis points to things like sophisticated information operations, and that's a huge piece we need to come back to. Cyber ops, electronic warfare, and of course, using proxy forces, like Wagner was, and now this Africa Corps.
And these aren't just random acts. The report says they target specific things.
Yeah, strategic targets. Transportation networks, government institutions, critical infrastructure, key industries even.
And the tactics, how do they do it?
The report mentions things like explosives, physically cutting vital communication cables, launching electronic attacks to disrupt systems, ways to cause chaos without necessarily having soldiers march in.
And the advantage for Russia is the ambiguity.
Precisely. That's the strategic brilliance from their perspective. If it's hard to even know an attack happened or who did it or even how to define it, is it war? Is it crime? Something else? Then mounting a conventional response becomes really, really complicated.
That makes sense. That calculated deniability must be a huge asset. If you can't be sure, you hesitate to escalate.
Right. It lets Russia pursue its objectives, maybe weakening Western influence, creating rifts and alliances, deterring aid to Ukraine, whatever it might be, at relatively low cost and low risk to itself.
And the analysis suggests this works particularly well in certain places.
Yes, it finds fertile ground in regions where governance structures might be weaker or where international oversight is fragmented. Parts of Africa, the report notes, can sometimes present that kind of environment. It's just ripe for this kind of low-cost, high-impact interference without immediate unified pushback.
Okay, so that's the shadow war framework. What about the second one? Neocolonialism. That's a strong term.
It is, and the analysis doesn't use it lightly. It presents it as a characterization strongly supported by the actual practices observed on the ground. It even quotes experts like Bohumil Dobouge,
Right.
who specifically described Wagner's operations in the Central African Republic CAR as and I'm quoting here, neo-imperialist and neo-colonial kind of state capture.
State capture. Wow. That's, very telling.
It is. The report frames Russia's whole contemporary strategy, sometimes called New Russianism, as fundamentally neo-colonial in its aims.
And those aims are?
It's multifaceted, but it all seems to converge. Strengthening Russia's influence, obviously. Systematically appropriating natural resources, that's key. Bypassing Western sanctions. And ultimately, displacing Western powers to push forward their vision of a multipolar world order.
But wait, isn't Russia always talking about fighting colonialism? That seems like a direct contradiction.
That's the critical paradox the analysis highlights. You're absolutely right. Russia consistently uses this powerful anti-colonial rhetoric. They position themselves as liberators, invoking the Soviet Union's history of supporting independence movements in Africa.
Yet at the same time.
At the same time, the actions described in the report are almost textbook neocolonialism, systematic resource extraction that primarily benefits Russia, propping up authoritarian leaders no matter their human rights record, actively undermining the sovereignty of the very states they claim they're helping.
So, why does the rhetoric work if the actions are so different?
That's a really important question the analysis digs into. It suggests the rhetoric is effective because it's strategically tapping into genuine historical grievances and into widespread contemporary anti-Western sentiment on the continent.
Okay.
Many African leaders and parts of the public, too, are disillusioned with Western aid that comes with conditions, or they perceive these lingering post-colonial influences. So when Russia comes in offering, say, no-strings-attached security.
It sounds appealing, even if the reality is different underneath.
Exactly. It appears free from those historical power dynamics, making it attractive, even if, as the report argues, it's just a different kind of exploitative relationship being established.
It sounds incredibly opportunistic, almost cynical, using this narrative of liberation to mask what's really about exploitation and geopolitical games.
The analysis definitely frames it that way, and it points out how this creates sort of information asymmetry. It makes it really hard for others to effectively counter that powerful narrative.
Okay, so let's talk about the main vehicle for this influence, Wagner and now Africa Corps. How did that evolution happen?
Right. So the Wagner Group, it really emerged as a significant player, a veritable actor, as the report calls it, in parts of Africa starting around 2017.
And Wagner was always this kind of hybrid thing, wasn't it? Nominally private, but clearly very close to the Russian state.
Exactly. A semi-proxy force that gave Moscow that crucial, plausible deniability we talked about earlier.
But then things changed dramatically after Prigozhin's mutiny in June 2023, and then his death.
Huge change. The analysis confirms there was this formal restructuring. Wagner's African operations were essentially folded into this new entity, now officially called the Africa Corps.
And the key differences?
The key difference is who's in charge. This new Africa Corps is explicitly placed under the direct control of Russia's Ministry of Defense, the military.
Ah, so no more pretending it's separate.
Pretty much. The report states this signifies Russia taking, quote, public and direct control over these groups. It basically undermines the ability to deny these formal connections.
So Russia can't really claim anymore that these forces are just independent contractors. Their actions are now directly attributable to the Russian state.
That's the implication. It definitely increases Moscow's direct accountability, especially for, the widespread human rights abuses that have been linked to these forces.
Which raises the question, why give up that deniability? It seems so useful for them.
Good question. The analysis suggests it was probably a necessary move for Moscow to reassert centralized control, first of all, ensure operational coherence after the chaos of the mutiny.
Makes sense. Get a tighter grip after Prigozhin went rogue.
Right, and maybe also to signal something else, a long-term institutional commitment to their strategy in Africa, to show this isn't just a temporary Wagner thing, but a core part of Russia's state policy now.
Interesting. So it centralizes power, aligns operations with Kremlin strategy, but at the cost of taking direct responsibility.
Exactly. And that formalization also makes it theoretically easier for the international community to respond, right? You know who to target with sanctions or accountability measures now. It's the Russian state.
Okay, so we understand the structure. Let's get into the why. What are the core motivations driving this big Russian push into Africa?
The analysis really points to a mix. Deep-seated geopolitical ambitions combined with some very urgent economic needs. And all of it is about exploiting existing vulnerabilities within certain African states.
Let's start with the geopolitical side.
Okay. It's framed pretty clearly as a strategic pivot. Russia is actively trying to counterbalance Western influence and push for that multipolar world order we mentioned.
Challenging democratic norms.
Yeah, challenging norms they often portray as Western impositions. The analysis says they're skilled at exploiting perceived Western failures or historical baggage. They talk about an unbalanced model of global development or neocolonial policies of the West.
Positioning themselves as the alternative, the providential nation, as the report puts it sometimes.
Right. And they're very good at filling power vacuums. The report gives examples in the Sahel stepping in after, say, U.S. forces leave Niger, or French forces were pushed out of Mali and Burkina Faso. They see an opening and they take it.
And the ultimate goal of filling these vacuums.
The analysis suggests it's to cultivate a bloc of African states that are under Russian influence, states that can then be used to help undermine Western interests. Often through these unconventional shadow war type methods, Africa becomes a tool in a larger global game.
So Africa isn't really the main focus in itself. It's more of a theater.
That's how the report frames it often, a theater of strategic opportunity, a collateral effort in this bigger competition with the West.
Which explains why genuine development might take a back seat.
Precisely. If the goal is geopolitical leverage, not necessarily long-term stability or prosperity for the African nation itself, then the approach changes. It explains why they're comfortable aligning with authoritarian regimes and why their presence can actually be destabilizing or undermine democratic transitions. Human rights, democratic reforms, those are seen as Western conditions that just get in the way of Russia's strategic objectives.
Okay, that's the geopolitical angle. What about the economic drivers? You said they were urgent.
Absolutely crucial, according to the analysis. It makes it very clear. A huge part of this is about the systematic appropriation of Africa's vast natural resources.
Like what specifically?
Gold, diamonds, timber, uranium, lithium, you name it. High-value resources.
And this serves two main purposes for Russia.
Yes, a critical dual purpose. First, it provides direct funding, money they desperately need, especially for the war effort in Ukraine. Second, it's a vital way to get around Western sanctions. Accessing and selling these resources gives them revenue streams outside the sanctioned financial systems.
How does that work in practice, this resource extraction?
The report details this very transactional model. Basically, Russia offers what it calls regime survival packages.
Winning.
Military support, diplomatic cover at the UN, protection for leaders. Essentially, helping keep certain governments in power, especially those facing internal threats or international isolation.
In return.
In return, Russia gets privileged access, concessions for mining, logging, you name it. It's what the report calls the military business model. Security traded directly for economic resources.
And who benefits from these deals?
Primarily, the benefits flow upwards to the local political elites who make the deals, and of course to the Moscow-linked intermediaries and companies doing the extracting.
Not the local population.
Generally not, according to the analysis.
But
local populations often remain in poverty, face displacement, and the environment suffers significant degradation from unchecked extraction.
the report mentions a kind of vicious cycle this creates.
Yeah, this is really important. It's described as quite predatory. Russia offers security, which helps them get control over resources. But their operations, the fighting, the abuses, often intensify conflict and instability.
Which, paradoxically,
Creates more demand for their security services. So it reinforces their presence, justifies even more resource extraction, and makes the host country even more dependent on them. It's a nasty cycle.
so it becomes self-funding, essentially.
Yes.
African resources pay for Russia's operations there and potentially elsewhere.
Exactly. It's a self-sustaining financial model for their global shadow war. African resources directly bankroll geopolitical ambitions, including the war in Ukraine, while locking these African states into these really asymmetric, exploitative relationships that undermine their own peace and development.
Okay, so we have the motivations. How do they actually do this? What are the operational methods used on the ground?
The analysis breaks it down into a few key areas. It's a combination of military force, sophisticated information manipulation, and those predatory economic practices we just discussed.
Let's start with the military and security side.
Right. It's that offer of unconditional security assistance, direct military support, protection for leaders, training for local forces.
And the appeal is the unconditional part.
Largely, yes. Especially for military elites or authoritarian leaders, it bypasses the human rights conditions or governance reforms that often come with Western security partnerships. It effectively insulates them from that kind of scrutiny.
And these Russian forces, Africa Corps now, they actually fight.
Oh, yes. The report documents their participation in direct combat in places like CRR and Mali. Sometimes they conduct operations independently of the local military.
And that's often linked to problems.
Yes. The analysis directly links those independent operations to some of the worst outcomes, including severe human rights abuses. And it notes that some leaders seem drawn to their particularly brutal methods, their scorched earth tactics in counterterrorism, even knowing the immense human cost.
But this security assistance isn't just about fighting insurgents, is it? You mentioned state capture earlier.
Exactly. The analysis argues it's a pathway to that.
Yeah.
By becoming the indispensable security provider, Russia gains enormous leverage. This can lead to getting their own people placed as advisors inside the government, like that example in CIR,
Uh-huh.
which then helps them secure those lucrative resource concessions, creates deeper dependencies, and ultimately entrenches authoritarian rule. It all serves Russia's broader geopolitical goals.
Okay, so military leverage is one tool. What about information warfare? You said that was huge.
Absolutely critical. The analysis portrays Russia as a dominant force here, possibly responsible for something like 40% of all disinformation targeting Africa. They engage in what the report calls cognitive warfare.
Cognitive warfare. What does that entail?
It's using a massive range of tools to manipulate perception, creating fake news articles, highly sophisticated social media campaigns using TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, plus their state-backed outlets like RT and African Stream.
Right.
They set up covert media networks, doppelganger websites that mimic legitimate news sources. They use paid influencers, even organize ground support groups to amplify their messages. It's multi-layered.
And what kind of messages are they pushing?
The content strategy is pretty clear. Amplify existing social divisions within countries, actively foster distrust in democratic institutions and elections, push aggressive anti-Western narratives blaming France, the US, the EU for problems, and constantly craft this image of Russia as a benevolent, reliable partner, a true friend to Africa.
And they tailor it to local contexts.
Very skillfully, the report notes. They're adept at exploiting local grievances, tapping into historical sensitivities around colonialism, making their narratives resonate more effectively.
The CARE example came up again here, didn't it?
Yes, detailing how Wagner-linked networks systematically infiltrated local media. They used hidden funding, sometimes intimidation of local journalists, to pump out pro-Kremlin narratives and drown out alternative voices.
And the goal of all this cognitive warfare.
It's not just random noise. The report says it's, quote, strategically designed to exploit local grievances, inflame tensions, and weaken democratic institutions. It aims to undermine constructive public debate, make citizens question facts, and ultimately make societies more susceptible to manipulation.
And does it work?
The analysis suggests it has worrying outcomes. It can lead to increased acceptance of these Russian-backed narratives, sometimes manufacturing surges in public approval for Russia, and it erodes what the report terms cognitive sovereignty, meaning a society's ability to think for itself, basically, to make informed decisions based on reliable information. When that's eroded, societies become much more vulnerable to authoritarian influences and external manipulation.
Okay, military information. What about the economic side again? The actual extraction?
Right, back to the resources. Extracting valuable stuff, gold, diamonds, timber, uranium, lithium is central. The analysis details how they do it, often using shell companies to mask the Russian state or military links. It cites examples like M-Invest and Murrow Gold in Sudan.
Why the shell companies?
To obscure the money trail, facilitate smuggling, and maintain that veneer of plausible deniability, even if it's wearing thin now with Africa Corps. This allows for industrial-scale smuggling that deprives African states of billions in potential revenue.
You mentioned a figure earlier.
Yeah, the report highlights an estimate over $2.5 billion laundered just from the African gold trade for the Kremlin since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began in February 2022.
$2.5 billion. That's staggering.
It really is, and it shows the scale of wealth being siphoned away, potentially funding the war in Ukraine, while those resources could be used for development in Africa.
And the methods for getting control of these resources, like mines.
Often brutal, according to the report, especially when dealing with artisanal miners who might already be working in area. It describes violence, torture, rape, outright theft to seize control of valuable mining sites.
And this ties back to state capture.
Absolutely. Controlling key economic sectors gives Russia immense influence over government decisions, ensuring policies favor their interests. It feeds that self-sustaining financial model we discussed, funding the operations, funding expansion, funding global ambitions, helping bypass sanctions, African resources directly fueling Russian aggression elsewhere.
Okay, one more method mentioned. Political interference.
Yes. The analysis notes what it calls a historical tradition, going back to Soviet times, of Russia being involved in orchestrating coups or backing unconstitutional power grabs. Often, though not always, with an eye on securing control over resources afterwards.
And more recently, beyond coups.
There is evidence cited of more direct election interference, too. The report mentions the alleged role of Russian groups in delaying elections in Mali, for instance, or Prigozhin-linked groups being documented overseeing the 2018 election in Zimbabwe.
And they offer protection to leaders they back.
Yes, a key part of the package seems to be offering political protection against international condemnation. essentially using Russia's diplomatic clout, like its UN Security Council veto, to shield leaders from pressure over human rights abuses or democratic backsliding. Helps keep them in power, indebted to Moscow.
And there's an ideological element, too.
Definitely. The analysis points to Russia actively promoting non-democratic systems, arguing openly that, quote, political systems other than democracy can be more effective, and pushing for the inviolability of authoritarian regimes and impunity for their actions.
So they're not just working with authoritarians, they're actively promoting authoritarianism.
That's what the analysis suggests. It's a strategic objective. It aligns with Russia's broader ideological fight against Western-style democracy. And, conveniently, it creates a much more favorable operating environment for their military business model, less accountability, fewer checks and balances to worry about.
Okay, that's a lot of methods. Can we look at how this plays out in specific countries, the case studies? Sikar seems to be ground zero.
Yeah, Siakar is often presented as the primary example, almost the blueprint. Wagner arrived there back in 2018, ostensibly for training and protecting the government, but very quickly linked to protecting mines.
They even got a UN arms embargo exception, right? For trainers.
Right, but these trainers were heavily armed, deeply involved in combat operations, and soon linked to significant violence.
And this is where that state capture description really fits.
Absolutely. The analysis details how they infiltrated key government posts. Famously, a Russian national was appointed as the president's national security advisor, giving Moscow incredible leverage from within.
And the human rights situation.
Horrific, according to the report. Widespread abuses linked to Wagner and now presumably Africa Corps. Villages razed, murder, torture, even things like disembowelment reported, especially when they operate independently outside the capital.
And the resource grab.
A primary objective. Direct links highlighted between Wagner Africa Corps and companies like Diamville used to extract and launder gold and diamonds. Plus, extensive disinformation campaigns targeting the local population, infiltrating media to push pro-Kremlin narratives.
And they're still there, even after the Wagner to Africa Corps shift.
Yes, the analysis estimated over 1,600 Africa Corps personnel were still in CRR as of May 2024. It shows how deeply embedded this model has become there.
Okay, what about Mali, another major area?
Yeah, Mali's another significant theater. Russia moved in there, especially after French forces began withdrawing. They really capitalized on the military junta's struggles with jihadist insurgencies and their frustration with perceived Western failures or conditions.
So the junta welcomed them.
Explicitly, they welcomed Russia's offer of aggressive, no-strings-attached security assistance as a better alternative.
But the results?
Yeah.
Have they improved security?
That's the paradox. The analysis details severe consequences. Russian-linked forces are implicated in major atrocities like the Mora massacre, and despite, or maybe because of, their brutal tactics, the overall security situation has demonstrably worsened.
How so?
Civilian deaths reportedly triple since Wagner deployed. Terrorist violence surged by something like 278%. It highlights the ineffectiveness or even counterproductivity of their approach against these complex insurgencies.
And the economic deals followed.
Of course. Agreements for a gold refinery, a deal with Rosatom, Russia's state nuclear company, changes to the mining trade that reportedly favor Russian interests, and clear evidence that gold revenues are being diverted to pay the mercenaries.
Plus the information warfare.
Rampant in Mali, spreading fake reports blaming France for instability, coordinated social media campaigns, calls to boycott French media, and again, links reported between Russian groups and efforts to postpone democratic elections.
And Mali is now part of this Russian-backed Sahel alliance.
Yes, a core member of the Alliance of Sahel States, along with Burkina Faso and Niger. And the Africa Corps presence is substantial, around 2,000 personnel estimated there in May 2024.
The analysis mentions others briefly too, right? Just to show the scope.
Yeah, it touches on Sudan, highlighting the gold exploitation and the long-standing ties to the RSF paramilitary group, suggesting resource control was a key factor in Russia's involvement there. Burkina Faso saw a similar post-coup shift towards Russia, increased disinformation, and a big gold mining deal involving a Russia-linked company, Nordgold.
Libya, Niger.
Libya continues to be important as a logistical hub for moving troops and equipment, with reports of increasing Russian troop numbers there, and Niger is the latest example, with Africa Corps arriving after the coup. Interestingly, the analysis points to Russia potentially using its influence there to weaponize migration flows towards Europe.
Okay, so putting it all together, based on this analysis, what are the big picture impacts on the African nations involved?
Well, politically, the consistent theme is increased instability and a deliberate undermining of democracy. Support for coups, democratic setbacks, backing authoritarians, actively dismantling democratic checks and balances.
And security-wise, despite being there for security.
The picture is pretty bleak, generally. Security often gets worse, not better. More militant attacks, higher civilian death tolls. Remember that tripling in Mali. Pervasive, severe human rights abuses are a constant feature across multiple countries where they operate.
That paradox again, claiming to provide security but violence increases.
Exactly. And the report also notes spillover effects into neighboring countries, potentially endangering UN peacekeepers and hindering regional security efforts through disinformation and interference with regional bodies.
Economically.
It's defined by that exploitative resource extraction: gold, diamonds, timber, uranium, lithium, illicit activities, smuggling, opaque deals that divert billions in revenue away from state coffers where it's desperately needed.
And the benefits go
Overwhelmingly to local elites who cut the deals and to the foreign intermediaries and Russian state entities. Local populations are largely left behind, facing poverty and environmental damage. It creates these new, deeply asymmetric dependencies, a clear form of neocolonialism, as the analysis argues.
Any other economic impacts?
Yeah, the knock-on effects of the Ukraine war on global food supply chains are mentioned, impacting food security in Africa. And the report also highlights the exploitation of African labor, sometimes forced labor, sometimes recruitment as mercenaries for conflicts elsewhere.
And societally, culturally, what does the disinformation do?
It has a really profound corrosive impact. It erodes trust in government, trust in media, trust in democratic processes. It amplifies existing social divisions, fuels polarization, and fosters anti-Western sentiment, making constructive dialogue much harder.
That cognitive warfare idea again.
Right. It's about manufacturing consent, eroding that cognitive sovereignty, making societies less able to resist manipulation. The analysis even points out documented racism and discrimination faced by Africans in Russia itself, despite the official narrative of friendship. And again, the direct exploitation of African citizens as cheap labor or cannon fodder.
So faced with all this, how are the international community and African nations themselves responding?
Well, the international community, particularly Western powers, largely views this as a significant geopolitical threat, undermining alliances, disrupting security, challenging their influence.
And what actions are they taking?
The report mentions things like increased intelligence sharing among Western allies, more surveillance and patrols, efforts to harden critical infrastructure against sabotage, and targeted sanctions against Wagner-related companies and now likely Africa Corps entities. The U.S. has been particularly vocal in its criticism.
And calls for accountability.
Growing calls, yes, especially now that Africa Corps makes the link to the Russian state explicit. Policy recommendations often focus on more diplomatic pressure, much bigger investment in counter-disinformation efforts, which seems crucial given how central info ops are publicizing Russia's failures and abuses, and faster, better coordinated sanctions.
Okay, what about African perspectives? It must be complex.
Extremely complex and very mixed. You have some leaders, particularly those maybe who took power undemocratically or feel isolated, who actively embrace Russia. That no-strings-attached offer is appealing. It lets them consolidate power without facing awkward questions about human rights or democracy from Western partners.
But what about the public? Or other leaders?
Public sentiment, where people see the abuses or the lack of real economic benefit, is often negative, according to the report. But and this is critical, those pro-Russian narratives are being pushed hard through disinformation, bots, paid influencers, state media, trying to shape public opinion in Russia's favor.
Is the African Union doing anything?
They are taking steps. The report mentions they're addressing the whole issue of foreign mercenaries and PMCs. There's work apparently underway to update an old 1977 convention on mercenaries, develop a new policy brief, monitor abuses, potentially impose tougher penalties on countries employing these groups. There are calls for greater African unity against all forms of external interference.
So African nations are trying to navigate this.
They are. It's an increasingly multipolar world, and many African nations are trying to seek diverse partnerships, investment, loans, trade from everyone: China, the EU, the US, Turkey, the Gulf states, and Russia.
But Russia's economic clout isn't actually that big compared to others, is it?
No, the analysis notes that while Russia has done things like write off some old Soviet-era debt and trade has increased, its overall economic footprint in Africa is still pretty modest compared to, say, China or the EU.
So the challenge for African nations is?
It's immense. Maintaining neutrality if they choose to, defending their sovereignty and resources, pushing for genuine reform and development, and resisting exploitation, frankly, from any external power, regardless of the flag they fly or the rhetoric they use.
Okay, let's try to wrap this up. Bringing this deep dive to a close, what's the absolute core finding from this analysis?
The core finding is pretty stark, I think. It presents Russia's engagement in Africa first via Wagner, now formalized as Africa Corps, not as a partnership for mutual benefit, but as a sophisticated, deeply concerning neo-colonial project.
A calculated strategy using multiple tools.
Exactly. Seamlessly integrating military force, predatory economics, and advanced information warfare, all aimed at advancing Moscow's geopolitical goals and securing vital resources.
Resources needed specifically to fund the war in Ukraine and get around sanctions.
That's presented as a primary driver, yes.
And that central paradox holds true throughout. Anti-colonial talk versus colonial practice.
Undeniably. Russia uses the language of liberation to mask what the analysis clearly identifies as 21st century colonial practices. Resource extraction, propping up dictators, undermining democracy. And the report explains why that rhetoric still finds purchase by expertly tapping into those real historical grievances and anti-Western feeling.
And the consequences for Africa.
Overwhelmingly detrimental, according to this analysis. More instability, more conflict, horrific human rights abuses, an exploitative economic model that drains wealth, and this insidious cognitive warfare eroding sovereignty from the inside out by manipulating what people believe.
And the shift to Africa Corps doesn't change the substance, just the label.
It seems to signal a long-term commitment, institutionalizing these ambitions. It might increase Russia's direct accountability, but it also embeds the strategy more deeply within the Russian state apparatus.
So the bottom line from the report is,
Russia's presence isn't about African development. It's a strategic play for global power, for sanctions evasion, and for resources, and it's being conducted largely at Africa's expense. Countering it effectively, the report implies, needs a concerted effort, exposing the real intentions, demanding accountability, and critically supporting African nations in building their own resilience to all forms of external manipulation.
we've definitely covered a lot of ground pulling from this analysis. It really lays bare the complexity, doesn't it? And the huge challenge facing African nations trying to chart their own course amidst these incredibly powerful external forces.
It does. And maybe a final thought for you listening to this. Given everything we've discussed from the analysis, especially how effective that information warfare seems to be in shaping what people think, and that vicious cycle where instability actually fuels the resource extraction that Russia benefits from, how can African nations realistically navigate this? How can they prioritize their own stability and long-term development when facing these kinds of sophisticated external pressures? What part of this whole dynamic really stands out most to you?
That is definitely the critical question to reflect on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.